The moment the wheelchair crashed against the pavement, a lifetime of earned dignity shattered alongside it. Metal shrieked across concrete, the sound cutting through the quiet morning like a blade. Colonel Arthur Lennox's body jerked forward, his weathered hands instinctively reaching out to break the fall, but gravity had already won. His jaw clenched tight, holding back any cry of pain, a reflex built over decades of discipline. Behind him, Chad Lawson stood frozen for half a second, then broke into a slow, satisfied smirk. His Letterman jacket hung loose on his shoulders, the kind of arrogance only a kid who'd never faced real consequences could wear. His friends laughed nervously behind him, uncertain whether to celebrate or scatter. And then, cutting through the shocked silence, came a sound that didn't belong in this peaceful suburb. The deep, measured thrum of high-end engines. Not the aggressive roar of sports cars, but something darker, more controlled. The kind of sound that announces arrival without needing to shout. Multiple vehicles moving in perfect formation, growing louder, closer, inevitable. If you believe respect is earned through sacrifice, if you stand against cruelty toward those who've served, and if you understand that true power and kindness moves in silence, please like, comment, share, and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. For Colonel Arthur Lennox, mornings had always been a matter of routine. Not because he enjoyed the slow roll to the bus stop, not because he looked forward to the stares from passing strangers, but because routine was dignity. Structure was purpose. Ever since the IED took his legs in Kandahar 7 years ago, he'd been fighting a different kind of war, proving he wasn't broken, that he wasn't a burden, that the uniform he once wore still meant something. But the world didn't always salute back, and some people, like Chad Lawson, the boy now grinning at his pain, seemed to believe that authority ended the moment you couldn't stand on your own 2 feet. The colonel had left his nephew's house early that morning, wheeling himself down the familiar sidewalk in steady, measured pushes. He tried to focus on the good, the cool morning air, the quiet streets, the simple freedom of movement. But he couldn't ignore the knot of tension that formed in his chest each time he approached this particular corner. Chad and his crew were often here. They weren't always physical, but their disrespect cut deeper than any shrapnel. Muttered jokes about wheels, mock salutes, followed by laughter, questions about whether he could still fight from his chair. Words designed to strip away everything he'd earned in blood and sand. Today, the colonel thought maybe he'd catch a break. Maybe the bus would come early. Maybe Chad would sleep in. But luck had never been the colonel's strongest ally. Chad arrived first, his walk more of a strut, chest puffed with the confidence of someone who'd never been truly tested. 2 of his friends flanked him, feeding off his energy, already chuckling before anything had even happened. The colonel tried to position his chair near the bus sign, angling away from them, keeping his eyes forward with military precision. Ignore them. They're children. They don't know what they don't know. But Chad had already decided this morning would be different. He'd already chosen his entertainment. He walked straight toward the wheelchair, his shadow falling across the colonel's lap. He leaned in just close enough to invade the veteran's space, close enough that the colonel could smell the energy drink on his breath. "Morning, Colonel Wheels," Chad said, voice dripping with mock respect. The colonel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Engagement was what they wanted. Chad glanced back at his friends, then down at the wheelchair, and with one sudden, deliberate motion, he planted his foot against the front wheel and shoved. The world tilted violently. The colonel's hands shot out, trying to catch himself, but the physics were already in motion. The chair tipped sideways, then forward, spilling him onto the concrete with a brutal, unforgiving crash. His shoulder took the brunt of it, pain flaring white-hot through his arm. His cap tumbled into the gutter. He didn't cry out, wouldn't give them that. But his breathing came hard and fast, each inhale a battle against humiliation more than pain. Chad laughed a sharp, ugly sound. "Whoops, guess you should watch where you're rolling, old man." But then everything changed. A sound rose from the end of the street. First faint, then unmistakable. Not the thunder of motorcycle engines, not the aggressive rev of muscle cars. This was different, the deep, luxurious purr of expensive vehicles, moving with coordinated precision, the kind of sound that carried weight, authority, purpose. The street seemed to still beneath the approaching presence. Chad's friends stopped laughing. They turned toward the sound, their smiles faltering. The colonel, still on the ground beside his overturned chair, lifted his head, his breath catching. A line of black SUVs, sleek, pristine, windows tinted to opacity, rolled down the quiet suburban street in perfect formation, one behind the other, spaced with military exactness. Their engines idled with a controlled growl that vibrated through the pavement. There weren't two. There weren't five. There were 8 vehicles, moving like a procession, like an escort, like something that didn't belong in this neighborhood but had arrived with absolute certainty. The colonel stared, disbelief mixing with something else, recognition. The kind of discipline in that formation, the silent authority of it, reminded him of convoys he'd once commanded, but this wasn't military. This was something else entirely. Chad took a step back, his smirk cracking at the edges for the first time all morning. His friends shifted nervously, suddenly aware they were no longer the most dangerous thing on this street corner. As the lead SUV reached the bus stop, it slowed, then stopped. The others followed suit, forming a tight semicircle around the fallen colonel. The engines continued their low, threatening idle, the sound of power held carefully in check. The doors didn't open immediately. The moment stretched, heavy with expectation, thick with unspoken judgment. And then, with deliberate slowness, the rear door of the lead vehicle opened. Set up, a man emerged from the lead SUV with the kind of calm that only comes from absolute certainty. Vincent Marcellus didn't rush, didn't need to. His movements were measured, deliberate, each step carrying the weight of unquestionable authority. He wore a dark suit tailored to perfection, the kind that whispered wealth without shouting it. His salt and pepper hair was combed back with precision, and his face, sharp-featured, weathered by decisions most men would never have to make, remained completely neutral as his eyes swept across the scene. Behind him, 2 more doors opened in perfect synchronization. From the passenger side emerged a mountain of a man, easily 6'5", with shoulders that seemed to challenge the doorframe itself. Roman Keaton moved like a boulder given human form, slow, inevitable, unstoppable. His suit strained slightly across his chest, and his hands, clasped loosely in front of him, looked capable of bending steel. His face was all hard angles and old scars, but his eyes held an unsettling intelligence that suggested the muscle was merely packaging for something far more dangerous. From the opposite side came his counterpart in lethality, though completely different in presentation. Silas Grant was lean, almost slight, dressed in black from collar to shoe. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, each step silent despite the concrete beneath his feet. His face was pale, expressionless, and his eyes cold, calculating, empty of mercy, surveyed the scene with the detached interest of someone cataloging targets. He didn't need to be big. Everything about him suggested that size was irrelevant when you knew exactly where to strike. The 3 of them stood for a moment beside the lead vehicle, a tableau of controlled violence wrapped in expensive fabric. Behind them, the doors of the other SUVs remained closed, but shadows shifted within. The message was clear. What you're seeing is only the beginning. What remains hidden is worse. Vince's eyes found the colonel first, still on the ground, beside his overturned wheelchair, and something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or respect. Then his gaze shifted to Chad, who stood frozen 3 feet away, his smirk now completely dissolved into something approaching fear. Vince held his stare for exactly 2 seconds, not long enough to be a challenge, just long enough to acknowledge that he'd been seen, noted, and filed away for later consideration. Then, Vince looked away. dismissing Chad as completely as if he'd ceased to exist. The dismissal was more devastating than any threat could have been. Roman moved first, his massive frame shifting to the left with surprising fluidity. He didn't approach Chad. Didn't need to. He simply positioned himself between the teenager and the colonel, his body creating a wall of silent intimidation. His arms crossed over his chest, and he stared straight ahead, not at Chad, not at anyone, just stood there like a monument to consequences, breathing slowly and evenly. Chad felt his legs weaken. He'd been in fights before, won most of them through size and aggression, but this was different. Roman wasn't preparing to fight. He was simply occupying space, and somehow that was more terrifying than any raised fist. Silas moved with equal precision to the right, creating the other point of a triangle. Unlike Roman, he did look at Chad, one long, analytical glance that seemed to measure every vulnerable point on his body, calculate every possible way things could go wrong for him. Then Silas's attention shifted away as well, scanning the street with professional detachment, hands hanging loosely at his sides. But Chad had seen enough movies, heard enough stories, to recognize what those hands meant. Weapons, hidden but ready, close but not needed. Yet, the two of them had created a barrier, a psychological perimeter that Chad's friends immediately recognized. Without a word, without any obvious threat, the other teenagers began backing away, their casual cruelty replaced by the kind of animal instinct that recognizes genuine danger. One of them muttered something about needing to get home. Another simply turned and walked quickly in the opposite direction. Chad wanted to follow them. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to run, to disappear, to pretend this morning had never happened. But his legs wouldn't obey. He stood there, trapped not by hands or weapons, but by the suffocating presence of men who dealt in violence the way bankers deal in numbers professionally, efficiently, without emotion. Vince Marcellus walked past Chad as if he were furniture. Didn't glance at him, didn't acknowledge him, simply moved with that same measured pace toward the fallen colonel, his expensive shoes clicking softly against the concrete. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the silence that had settled over the street. He stopped beside the overturned wheelchair, taking a moment to assess the situation with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen his share of casualties. The colonel, still on the ground, looked up at him with confusion and wariness mixing in his weathered face. Veterans learned not to trust help that came without explanation. Vince lowered himself into a crouch with the ease of someone half his age, bringing himself to eye level with the colonel. Up close, the similarities between them became more apparent. The same straight-backed bearing despite their positions, the same measuring gaze, the same recognition of hierarchy and respect that came from living in worlds where such things meant the difference between life and death. "Sir," Vince said quietly, his voice surprisingly soft, carrying none of the gravel or menace one might expect from a man who commanded such loyalty and fear. "May I help you?" Not a statement, a question. Asking permission. Offering respect in the form of choice. The colonel's eyes narrowed, studying him. "Do I know you?" "No, sir." Vince's expression didn't change. "But I know men like you. Knew several in my younger years. They taught me that some things are non-negotiable. Respect for those who've served is one of them." Something passed between them in that moment, an unspoken understanding, the recognition of codes lived by rather than spoken about. The colonel gave a small nod, and Vince took that as permission. He reached for the wheelchair first, his movements careful and precise despite the obvious strength in his hands. He righted it in one smooth motion, checking the wheels with a quick, professional assessment before positioning it beside the colonel. Then, he offered his arm, supporting the veteran's weight as he helped him rise from the concrete. There was no rush, no impatience. Vince moved at the colonel's pace, adjusting his support as needed, his touch firm but respectful. Behind them, Roman and Silas remained in position, their presence creating an invisible shield around the scene. The morning sun caught the chrome of the SUVs, reflecting light like a warning. A few neighbors had appeared in windows and doorways, drawn by the unusual presence, but none approached. The energy radiating from Vince's crew suggested this was not a moment for civilian intervention. Once the colonel was settled back in his wheelchair, Vince knelt again, checking him over with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done field assessments before. "Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm fine," the colonel said, though his shoulder would be screaming for the next week. "Just my pride took the real hit." Vince's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Pride is earned, sir. What happened here?" He gestured vaguely toward Chad without looking at him. "That's not about your pride. That's about a boy who never learned the first rule of civilization, which is, protect those who can't protect themselves. Honor those who've already paid the price." Vince straightened, adjusting his suit jacket with a quick tug. "I apologize that you had to experience this disrespect in my neighborhood." "Your neighborhood?" The colonel raised an eyebrow. In a manner of speaking, Vince's lips twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile. "I've invested significantly in the area's stability. This kind of behavior threatens that investment." The colonel understood perfectly. The words between the words. The code being spoken in broad daylight, but heard only by those who knew the language. Vince turned then, finally giving Chad his full attention. The teenager had remained rooted to his spot, watching the entire exchange with growing horror as he realized exactly how badly he'd miscalculated. Vince didn't approach him, didn't raise his voice, simply looked at him with those cold, assessing eyes that had seen men broken for far less than what Chad had done. "What's your name?" "Son?" Vince asked, his tone conversational. Chad's mouth moved, but no sound came out. He tried again. Chad Lawson. Chad Lawson." Vince repeated it slowly, as if committing it to memory, as if filing it away in some internal database that never forgot a name, never forgot a debt. "You understand what you did here this morning?" Chad nodded frantically. I'm sorry. I didn't." "You didn't what?" Vince's voice remained level, almost gentle. "Didn't mean to? Didn't think about it? Didn't consider that actions have consequences?" He paused, letting the silence build. "Or you didn't think anyone would care enough to stop you?" The teenager's face had gone pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Vince continued, his words measured and final. "I'm going to explain something to you once, Chad Lawson, because I believe in giving young men a chance to learn before consequences become permanent. That man," he gestured toward the colonel without looking away from Chad, "sacrificed parts of himself most people can't even imagine losing. He did it so you could stand here in your comfortable neighborhood, wear your expensive jacket, and waste your potential on cruelty. Do you understand what that means?" Chad nodded again, unable to form words. "It means you owe him. It means every person who served owes him. It means this community owes him. And when someone in my neighborhood fails to pay what they owe," Vince let the sentence hang unfinished, more terrifying for what remained unsaid. "Do we understand each other?" "Yes," Chad whispered. "Yes, sir." "Good." Vince straightened his cuffs with casual precision. "Then I won't need to return, and you won't need to worry about seeing my friends again. Because this will never happen again. Yes? Never. I swear. Never again." Vince held his gaze for one more moment, then turned back to the colonel, his entire demeanor softening immediately. "Sir, may I offer you a ride? My driver can take you wherever you need to go." The colonel glanced at the line of SUVs, at Roman and Silas standing like silent sentinels, at Vince with his expensive suit and careful respect. "The bus will be here soon. I'll manage." "Of course you will," Vince agreed. "But the offer stands. Today or any day, you have difficulty in this neighborhood again. You ask anyone, where to find Vince Marcellus. Understood?" They shook hands, the grip firm and equal, two men from different worlds who'd somehow found common ground in the understanding that dignity mattered, that respect was currency, that some lines could never be crossed without payment. Vince returned to his SUV, Roman and Silas moving in perfect coordination to flank him. The doors closed with expensive, solid thuds. The engines purred back to life, and the entire procession pulled away as smoothly as it had arrived, leaving only the faint smell of expensive cologne and the lingering weight of their presence. Chad stood alone now, his friends long gone, his confidence shattered like glass. He looked at the colonel, opened his mouth to say something, an apology, an excuse, anything but the veteran, simply turned his wheelchair toward the approaching bus and rolled away without a single backward glance. The dismissal was complete. If you believe respect is earned through sacrifice, if you stand against cruelty toward those who've served, and if you understand that true power moves in silence, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Vincent Marcellus stepped out of the lead SUV with the kind of calm that only comes from absolute certainty. He wasn't tall in a way that demanded attention, but every movement he made carried weight. His suit was dark, perfectly tailored, the kind that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His shoes clicked against the pavement with measured precision as he surveyed the scene, before him the overturned wheelchair, the veteran on the concrete, the boy in the Letterman jacket standing frozen with his mouth half open. Vince's eyes, dark and unreadable, swept across Chad Lawson without stopping. He didn't acknowledge him, didn't pause, didn't even register the boy's existence as worthy of attention. It was the most devastating dismissal Chad had ever experienced, being looked through rather than looked at, as if he were nothing more than air. Behind Vince, two men emerged from the second vehicle. Roman Keaton stepped out first, his frame massive enough to block out the morning sun. His neck was thick as a tree trunk, his hands the size of dinner plates, and his face carried the kind of scars that told stories without words. He moved to Vince's left, his presence alone a statement of force. On Vince's right came Silas Grant, smaller but infinitely more dangerous in his silence. Where Roman was obvious power, Silas was coiled threat. His eyes were pale, almost colorless, and they tracked every movement on that street corner with predatory focus. He wore leather gloves despite the warm morning, and his hands stayed loose at his sides, ready. The rest of the crew emerged from the remaining vehicles. Men in dark suits, women with sharp eyes and sharper instincts. They fanned out in a loose formation that wasn't quite a circle, but felt like one, a perimeter of protection that surrounded the fallen colonel without crowding him. None of them looked at Chad. The boy had become invisible, irrelevant, beneath notice. Vince walked forward, his steps unhurried. He stopped at the edge of where Colonel Lennox lay, still trying to push himself up with trembling arms. The veteran's face was set in hard lines, jaw clenched against both pain and pride. He didn't want help, didn't want pity, didn't want to be seen like this. But Vince understood. He'd known men like this before, men who'd earned their pride through fire and blood, who carried their dignity like armor because it was the only thing left that couldn't be taken from them. Vince crouched down, lowering himself to the colonel's level with slow, deliberate respect. He didn't rush, didn't grab, didn't treat the veteran like a problem to be quickly solved. "Colonel," Vince said quietly, his voice barely above a murmur but carrying absolute sincerity. "Let me help you." The colonel's eyes met his, and for a moment there was resistance, pride warring with necessity. But something in Vince's expression, the lack of pity, the presence of genuine respect, made the veteran's shoulders ease just slightly. "I can," the colonel started. "I know you can," Vince interrupted gently. "But you don't have to. Not today." It was the perfect thing to say. Not, "You can't," but "you don't have to." Acknowledging capability while offering relief. The colonel's resistance crumbled, replaced by something that might have been gratitude. Vince reached for the wheelchair first, riding it with careful efficiency. He checked the wheels, tested the frame, made sure nothing was bent or broken. Then he turned his attention back to the colonel, sliding one arm beneath the veteran's shoulders with surprising gentleness, for a man whose reputation was built on controlled violence. "On three," Vince said. "1, 2, 3. He lifted with smooth strength, supporting the colonel's weight as if it were nothing, helping him settle back into the wheelchair with the kind of care usually reserved for something precious. The colonel winced as his body settled, shoulder clearly aching, but his breathing steadied. Vince knelt again, eye level once more. "You hurt anywhere else? Need a hospital?" The colonel shook his head, his voice rough when he finally spoke. "Just my shoulder. And my pride." A ghost of a smile touched Vince's lips. "Pride heals slower than bone, but it heals." Behind them, Roman had shifted position, placing himself directly between Chad and the colonel. The boy hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, seemed barely to breathe. His earlier bravado had evaporated completely, replaced by pale-faced terror. He understood, perhaps for the first time in his sheltered life, that there were consequences in this world that his parents' money and his athletic status couldn't protect him from. Silas stood to the side, hands still loose, eyes still tracking. He hadn't said a word, hadn't needed to. His presence was message enough. Vince adjusted the colonel's footrests, checked that his hands could reach the wheels comfortably, then straightened. He pulled a card from his inside jacket pocket, simple, cream-colored, with nothing but a phone number embossed in black ink. "You need anything," Vince said, pressing the card into the colonel's palm. "You call that number. Anything. You understand?" The colonel looked at the card, then back at Vince. Understanding passed between them, the kind that needs no explanation. This wasn't charity. This was one man of honor, recognizing another. "Why?" the colonel asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. Vince's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "My grandfather served Korea. Never talked about it much, but he taught me what respect means, what it's owed to." He glanced briefly at the medals pinned to the colonel's jacket. Bronze star, Purple Heart. "You earned more than respect. You earned protection. And in my world, Colonel, that debt gets paid." He straightened, then did something unexpected. Vince Marcellus, a man whose name made criminals and cops alike nervous, came to attention and rendered a crisp, perfect salute to the seated veteran. The colonel's eyes widened. Then, slowly, deliberately, he returned the salute, his weathered hand rising to his temple with the muscle memory of decades. The moment held, suspended in the quiet morning air, witnessed by the silent crew and the terrified boy. When Vince lowered his hand, he finally turned his attention to Chad. The boy flinched as if struck, though Vince hadn't moved toward him. "You," Vince said, his voice still quiet but now carrying an edge that could cut steel. "You're going to apologize." Chad's mouth worked soundlessly. His face had gone from pale to gray. I didn't." "Now," Vince said. Not louder, not angrier, just final. Chad stumbled forward, his legs barely holding him. He stopped a few feet from the wheelchair, unable to meet the colonel's eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words cracking. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean I shouldn't have." Tears were streaming down his face now. The reality of what he'd done, hitting him all at once, magnified by the presence of men who understood real violence and found his cruelty beneath contempt. The colonel studied him for a long moment. Then, with quiet dignity, he nodded. "Accepted. Don't let me see it again." "You won't," Chad choked out. "I swear you won't." Vince placed a hand on Chad's shoulder, not rough, but firm enough that the boy felt every ounce of restrained strength in those fingers. "He won't," Vince confirmed, looking at the colonel rather than Chad. "Because if he does, he'll answer to me. And that conversation won't be as pleasant as this one." He released Chad, who stumbled backward, nearly falling himself. Vince returned his attention to the colonel. "Your bus should be here soon. We'll wait with you." "You don't have to." "We want to," Vince said simply. And so they did. The crew of 8 vehicles, perhaps 20 people in total, stood in quiet formation around Colonel Arthur Lennox as the morning sun climbed higher. They didn't talk much, didn't need to. Their presence was the message. When the bus finally rounded the corner, the driver's eyes went wide at the scene. But when he saw the colonel, saw the wheelchair, understanding dawned. He lowered the ramp without being asked. Roman stepped forward, offering a hand to steady the wheelchair as the colonel rolled aboard. Vince walked alongside, ensuring safe passage. Once the colonel was secure, Vince stepped back onto the curb. "Thank you," the colonel said through the open door, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't quite hide. Vince nodded once. "Thank you, Colonel, for your service, for your example." As the bus pulled away, the colonel looked back through the window. The crew was already moving to their vehicles, smooth and coordinated. Vince stood by his SUV, and for just a moment, he raised his hand in farewell. The colonel raised his in return. Chad Lawson sat on the curb where he'd collapsed, head in his hands, shaking. He didn't look up as the motorcade pulled away, engines purring with restrained power. He didn't look up when his friends quietly disappeared, wanting no part of his shame. He sat there long after everyone had gone, the weight of his own cruelty finally devastatingly real. If this story reminded you that real strength protects rather than destroys, that honor recognizes honor regardless of background, and that sometimes the most unexpected guardian arrives exactly when dignity needs defending. Please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to remember that respect still matters in this world, and subscribe for more stories that prove kindness and power aren't opposites, they're partners. Please comment your thoughts below before the story ends. Your voice adds to this community of people who believe the world can still be better. The colonel carried that card in his wallet for years. He never needed to use it, but knowing it was there changed something fundamental. He rolled through his neighborhood with his head higher. He spoke in public with more confidence. And when he saw other veterans struggling, other people being diminished by casual cruelty, he remembered what true protection looked like. He remembered that dignity, once earned through sacrifice, should never be stolen by ignorance. And he remembered that in a world that often forgets honor, there are still those who live by codes older and deeper than law codes, that recognize what truly matters and defend it without hesitation. Chad never bothered another person again. He didn't become a saint overnight, but he became quieter, more careful, more aware that his actions carried weight he'd never considered. The terror of that morning had burned away his casual cruelty, leaving something raw and humble in its place. And somewhere across town, Vince Marcellus returned to his world of shadows and power, carrying with him the quiet satisfaction of a debt repaid to a grandfather he'd loved and a generation he'd never stop respecting. Because in the end, some things transcend the boundaries we build between people. Honor recognizes honor. Strength protects the vulnerable. And sometimes, justice arrives not with sirens and badges, but with the quiet purr of expensive engines and the steady gaze of men who understand that respect, once earned, is forever sacred. The end. If you believe respect is earned through sacrifice, if you stand against cruelty toward those who've served, and if you understand that true power moves in silence, please like, comment, share, and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.